He stands behind the curtain, holding a small, old cassette in his hand. It's cracked, worn. The label is fading. His fingers shake. The crowd is waiting. The cameras are rolling. He steps up to the microphone, his voice barely holding together. I've told 1,000 stories in my life, but this is the one that made me. He holds up the cassette. This tape. It's the only time I ever heard my father speak. Then silence. The kind of silence that breaks your heart before a single word is even played. When he was just a boy, the house he grew up in was quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy kind, the kind that wraps around your chest and makes it hard to breathe. His father couldn't speak, not even a whisper. An accident at the factory had stolen his voice before the boy was old enough to remember what it ever sounded like. There was no laughter in their home, no bedtime stories, no good job, son, no I love you, just the sounds of the world outside, wind through broken windows, the ticking of a wall clock, the creak of old wooden floors, and the soft hum of a cassette player in the corner. Dinner was silent, mornings were silent, even arguments were silent and just angry eyes and slammed doors. But the father was always there, sitting in his old chair by the window, fixing broken radios, cleaning the same shelves over and over. He never smiled much, never cried, just existed. The boy didn't understand it at first. Why his friends' dads could yell and laugh and sing, and his couldn't even say his name. He started to believe maybe he wasn't worth talking to. That silence began to feel like the truth. He never liked to ask questions about it, but one day, the boy finally did. He asked his mother, quietly, "Why doesn't Dad talk?" She paused for a long time. Then she told him about that day. Years ago, before the boy could remember, his father worked at a steel factory. Long shifts, dangerous machines, no safety, just sweat and noise and heat. He was young back then, full of life, full of stories, always singing under his breath. Until the accident. A loud crack, a chain snapping. A steel beam swung loose like a whip, crushing pipes and metal and voices. It hit him in the throat. Hard, fast, final. They said he screamed once, loud enough to freeze the whole floor. And then he never spoke again. The damage couldn't be fixed, not by surgery, not by time. His voice box was crushed, gone. He lost more than just his voice that day. He lost his job, his pride, his laughter, his place in the world. And when he came home from the hospital, he wasn't the same man. The singing was gone. The jokes were gone. The light in his eyes faded. He sat at the table in silence while the world moved on without him. And from that day on, the house stayed quiet too. After the accident, the house changed. It didn't happen all at once, it was slow, like watching the color fade from an old photograph. The air inside became heavier. Words, once so natural, now felt too loud, too strange. Even the boy, so full of questions, slowly learned not to ask. There were no good mornings in that house, no bedtime kisses with whispered wishes. Instead, everything was said with small gestures, a nod, a shake of the head, the tap of a finger on the table. And somehow, they made it work. But just because things worked, didn't mean they felt okay. The father would wake up early every day, pour cereal in a bowl, and slide it across the table. Without a word, the boy would eat in silence, glancing at his father, hoping for a smile. Sometimes he got one. Most days, he didn't. At night, the sound of neighbors talking through thin walls became their background music. Reminder that other homes still had voices, laughter, arguments, life. Inside their own four walls, there was just silence and routine. The father was never cruel. He didn't yell or hit or walk away. He was there, always, sitting quietly in the same chair, fixing things that didn't really need fixing, scribbling notes he never gave. But the love, the warmth, it was hard to feel. The boy started to wonder if maybe love was supposed to sound like something. And if that was true, then maybe his father didn't love him at all. But deep down, somewhere inside that silence, a story was waiting to be told. It just didn't have the words yet. He was 9 years old the night it happened. The day had been like any other, quiet, cold, and lonely. Dinner was silent. The air was heavy. The boy brushed his teeth, turned off the hallway light, and crawled into bed without saying good night. That's when he saw it, lying right on top of his pillow. A small, gray cassette tape. It looked old, a little dusty, but there was something written on it in neat, shaky letters. For you. No explanation, no note, no smile from the hallway, just the tape. His fingers touched it like it was made of glass. He didn't know what to expect, but he placed it into his little cassette player, the one his father had fixed up months ago. He pressed play. First, there was a soft static, a kind of warm, crackling sound, like the beginning of an old movie. Then, music. Not loud, not fancy, just gentle piano, mixed with the sound of rain. And after the music faded, a voice came on. It wasn't his father's voice, not really. It was the voice of an old radio host, reading a bedtime story, calm, steady, almost like a lullaby. The boy lay back, eyes wide, listening. The story was about a lonely bird who couldn't sing, but still flew across the sky every day just to watch the sunset. And in the end, the bird finds a friend who sings for him. Not because he asks, but because he needs it. When the tape ended, the room was still. The boy didn't know what to say. But that night, for the first time in a long time, he fell asleep with a smile. And in the other room, his father sat in his chair, staring at the wall with a blank tape in his hand, already planning the next one. After that first night, the tapes kept coming. Every evening, just before bed, the boy would find a new cassette waiting on his pillow. Sometimes it had a title, Adventure or the Moon or Dreams. Other times, it was blank, just a quiet little mystery waiting to be played. He never asked where they came from. He didn't have to. They were from his father. He knew it by the way they smelled faintly of metal and dust, by the way the handwriting shook a little more each week, by the way they always started with that soft static, the same warm sound that reminded him of a hug without arms. The tapes became their way of speaking. Each one had a different world inside it. Some nights it was music, cold jazz, soft lullabies, or sad songs with lyrics the boy didn't understand but somehow felt. Other nights, it was old radio shows, deep voices telling strange stories about lost travelers, time machines, lonely hearts, and faraway places where people still believed in magic. And every once in a while, there was a soft sound in the background, like someone breathing, or trying to whisper, but it always faded before he could be sure. His father never said anything about the tapes, never smiled when the boy carried them to his room, never asked if he liked them, but he kept making them, every night, like clockwork. And slowly, the boy stopped feeling so alone. In that quiet house with no laughter and no words, a voice had found its way in. Even if it wasn't spoken out loud, it was still heard. The tapes became more than bedtime stories. They became a part of him. Everywhere the boy went, his little blue Walkman came with him, clipped to his side like it was stitched into his skin. At school, while other kids laughed and chased each other on the playground, he'd sit under a tree with his headphones on, listening to voices from another world. In the car, while his mother drove in silence, he stared out the window with the tape playing in his ears, letting the music and the old stories fill the spaces no one else could. At night, when the wind rattled the windows and the loneliness felt too big to name, he'd reach for that tiny machine like it was his only friend. And in a way, it was. He didn't understand it yet, but those tapes were teaching him how to feel, how to listen, and maybe, just maybe, how to speak. At home, his father noticed. He never said anything, couldn't, but his eyes followed the boy more now. Sometimes, he'd sit at the kitchen table, watching as the boy rewound his favorite parts again and again. Sometimes, he'd hover near the door, listening as the boy laughed softly at an old radio joke or hummed along with a song he didn't even know he knew. The father never smiled, never clapped, never pointed to his own chest and said, "That was me." But he watched, quietly, constantly, as if seeing his son hear what he could no longer say was enough. And maybe it was because even though they still didn't talk, even though their house still held more silence than sound, something had changed. There was a thread between them now, woven from static and music and quiet hope. And the boy held it tightly in his hands. Not everyone understood the tapes. At school, the boy tried to keep them a secret. He'd tuck his Walkman deep into his backpack. He'd wait until recess to sneak in a few minutes of sound, just enough to feel like home again. But secrets don't stay hidden for long. One day, a group of boys spotted him behind the trees, headphones on, eyes closed, smiling at something only he could hear. They ran over, snatched the Walkman from his hands, and laughed. Old people stuff, one said, pressing random buttons. What's he even listening to? Probably ghost stories. No, wait. Isn't his dad the mute one? The laughter got louder, crueler. Bet his dad's a ghost too. That word stuck. Ghost. They started calling him that in the hallways, whispering it when he passed by, tapping their throats and pretending to lose their voices. He never said anything back, just lowered his eyes, clenched his fists, and walked faster. That night, he went home and stared at the newest tape on his pillow. He wanted to throw it away. He didn't. He wanted to stop listening. He couldn't. Instead, he waited until the house was asleep, curled under his blanket, pressed play, and let the voices soft, warm, and far away remind him of who he was. Because even if the world called his father a ghost, to him, that ghost was the only person who ever truly spoke. One night, after listening to a story for the 100th time, the boy paused the tape. He sat there in the dark, holding the recorder in his hands. The room was still, but something inside him was moving, like a whisper rising from his chest. He pressed the red button, and for the first time in his life, he spoke to the silence. It was awkward at first. His voice cracked. He didn't know what to say, but he started small, retelling one of the stories he'd heard on the tapes. Then he tried reading a bedtime book out loud, pretending he was the one tucking someone else in. Sometimes he just talked about school, about his dreams, about the kids who teased him. The microphone didn't laugh. It didn't mock him. It listened. And slowly, he found comfort in the sound of his own voice. It felt like magic. Like he'd taken the light his father had given him and found a way to shine it back. He didn't think anyone was listening, but someone was. One afternoon, he came home to find a small box on his bed. No note, no tape, just something, wrapped in soft cloth. He unfolded it slowly and found a microphone. Newer, stronger. He left home with a backpack, a handful of dreams, and a voice he was finally learning to trust. The city was loud, fast, and unforgiving. He lived in a tiny room that smelled like paint and old wires. The walls were thin, the mattress set on the floor, and his dinner was usually a cup of noodles, warmed over a borrowed kettle. But still he chased it. Every day, he went to auditions with shaking hands, read scripts in crowded cafes, sent voice samples to anyone who would listen. Rejection came often, money came rarely. There were nights he almost gave up, nights where the silence felt like it had followed him from home. But something kept him going. Every few weeks, a small envelope would show up in his mailbox. No return address, no letter, just a blank cassette. At first, he was confused. Then he smiled. They were from his father, he knew it without a doubt. He'd put the tapes into his player, press play, and there would be nothing, no sound, just soft static. Sometimes a faint breath, a click, a shuffle in the background. But even the silence meant something. It was his father's way of saying, "I'm still here, I'm listening." They didn't speak, they never called. But the boy, now a young man, knew he wasn't alone. And every time the world felt too big or his voice too small, he'd reach for one of those tapes and remember who first believed in him, without ever saying a word. It started with a whisper, not a real one, but a roll, a children's audiobook, just a few lines. A gentle voice for a forest animal. The pay was almost nothing, but he didn't care. It was his first real job. He recorded it in a closet, surrounded by pillows to block out the city noise. When he finished, he sent the file, then sat in silence, staring at his laptop. Days later, they emailed back. "We love your voice." Something inside him cracked open, something deep and warm and finally seen. That one job led to another. An indie video game, a small commercial, a short film narration. Then, one day, out of nowhere, a national brand called. A real spot, with real airtime. He couldn't believe it. When he heard his voice on the radio for the first time, strong, smooth, confident, he closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "That's me." He thought about all the nights under the blanket, playing tapes. All the mornings eating cereal in silence. All the cassettes marked with nothing but static and breath. He made it. Not all the way. Not yet. But his name was starting to mean something. And somewhere back home, in a quiet house with an old cassette deck still humming softly, his father was listening. He was in the middle of recording a new commercial when his phone buzzed. A number he didn't know. He almost didn't answer. But something, some deep ache in his chest told him to pick up. It was the nurse. "It's your father," she said gently. "He's in the hospital. You should come." No details. No promises. Just that voice. He packed a bag in silence, booked the earliest train, and as the city lights faded through the window, his thoughts sank back into the quiet house he had tried so long to outgrow. When he walked into the hospital room, the world slowed down. There he was, his father, pale, small, so much smaller than he remembered. Machines hummed softly, tubes ran like threads from his arms, and his eyes, those tired, familiar eyes, opened slowly when he stepped in. No voice. Not anymore. No notepad either. His hands shook too much now. But his eyes, they were speaking. They said, "You came." They said, "I'm proud." They said all the things he had waited his whole life to hear. The son pulled a chair beside the bed. He didn't know what to say. So he did what his father once did for him. He spoke. He told stories. Made jokes. Read the hospital pamphlets out loud like they were bedtime tales. And when the nurse came in later that night, she found them sitting like that. The son talking, the father listening, both of them surrounded by a silence that no longer felt empty, but full. It happened on a Tuesday. There was no warning, no final words, just the quiet beep of a monitor. And then nothing. The nurse came in, checked the screen, and placed a gentle hand on the son's shoulder. He didn't cry. Not right away. He just stared at his father's face, so still. Too still. The man who had once worked with his hands, who had built a world of sound from silence, was gone. No voice, no breath, just stillness. They buried him on a rainy morning. Few people came. No speeches, no songs. But the son brought one thing, a tape recorder. And he pressed play. Soft music rose from the speaker, the same song from that very first tape. Piano and rain. That was the eulogy. That night, he returned to the house. It looked smaller than he remembered, older, but nothing had changed. The same armchair, the same cassette deck on the shelf, the same quiet that had always lived in the walls. He walked into his old room, dust floating in the golden light, and there, sitting neatly inside a shoebox, beside a stack of blank tapes, was the one he had hidden away, the Gold Star tape. He picked it up slowly, hands trembling, and for the first time in years, he pressed play. He didn't sleep that night. After listening to the Gold Star tape, after hearing his father's faint, broken whisper say, "I love you," something in him cracked open. He couldn't stop shaking. He searched the house like he was chasing a ghost. Drawers, cabinets, closets. And then, in his old bedroom, beneath the bed where the tape pillow ritual had started, he found it, a wooden box. Dusty, heavy, and touched for years. He pulled it out with both hands and opened the lid. Inside were hundreds of cassette tapes, each one carefully labeled with dates. Some were marked with stars, some with symbols, others just carried his name. His breath caught in his throat. He picked one up at random. March 3, 2008, a bad dream. He remembered that night, waking up scared, crying silently into his pillow. His father had just hugged him, wordless. He popped the tape in and pressed play. Soft static. Then, a lullaby. The same melody his mother used to hum before she left. Then a whisper, "Barely there, you're safe now." He covered his mouth with his hand. Tears slipped from his eyes without warning. One by one, he played more tapes for his first day of school, for the day he broke his arm, for the Christmas when they couldn't afford a tree. Each one a message. Not spoken perfectly and sometimes not spoken at all, but felt. His father had been speaking to him the whole time, through music, through static, through silence. He just hadn't known how to listen until now. That night, in the quiet house where everything had once felt so cold and voiceless, the son sat on the floor, surrounded by tapes, and finally heard everything his father had always wanted to say. As the days passed, he kept listening, tape after tape. At first, it was music, old songs, radio stories, gentle hums between recordings. But then, as he grew more patient, he began to hear things he'd missed before. A breath, a pause, a faint chuckle, tucked between a song change. Then, a whisper, "You did good today." It hit him like a wave. Not because of the words, but because it was his father's voice. Shaky, faint, full of effort, and real. He rewound it, played it again, slower this time. "You did good today." He played another tape. This one had soft rain in the background, and then, barely above the static, "I know they teased you. You're still strong." Another. "One day, they'll hear you. I promise." His hands trembled as he played them, one by one. The messages weren't loud. They weren't perfect. But they were there. Words his father could never say to his face. Not because he didn't want to, but because he physically couldn't. So instead, he recorded them. Over months, years, a lifetime. Tiny gifts of love buried in static and silence. And now, as a grown man, the son was hearing them for the first time. Laughter he never remembered. Encouragement he never noticed. A voice he thought was lost. Was never gone. It had always been there, waiting for him to finally stop talking and listen. 3 words, 1 lifetime late. The Gold Star tape had been with him for years. It moved with him from his childhood bedroom to the city, to every apartment, every small success. He kept it like a secret, like something sacred. And for years, he was too afraid to play it. Until now, he sat alone in the living room of the house where he grew up. The air was still, the lights dim. The cassette clicked gently into place. He pressed play. Soft static filled the room. Then music, slow, familiar. A piano piece his father had used many times. Then, silence. Longer this time. He leaned in, holding his breath. At first, it sounded like nothing, just the faint hiss of the tape. But then, a breath, a sound like someone gathering all the air they could. And finally, "I love you." 3 words, whispered like a prayer. Broken, raspy, barely there, but real. He closed his eyes. The voice was cracked and fragile, the man forcing sound through ruined vocal cords. One last time. It must have taken everything he had, but he did it. The sun sat frozen. The tears didn't fall, they rushed. All the silence they had lived through, all the unspoken love. It was always there. And in those 3 words, whispered into an old plastic cassette, a father finally said everything. The lights were blinding. The cameras clicked. The audience waited. He stood at the podium, award in hand, heart racing in his chest. The applause had faded, and now, it was just silence. He looked out across the sea of faces. Famous people, strangers, everyone watching. But all he could think about was one man. One quiet man in a quiet house who never said much, but never stopped loving him. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the old cassette. Worn edges, Gold Star still shining faintly under the lights. The crowd shifted, confused. He smiled softly, eyes wet, voice shaking. "This is the only time my father ever spoke." He gently placed the tape into a small player resting on the podium. Pressed play. Music filled the air, soft, nostalgic, haunting. Then the static. Then the breath. And then, "I love you." The room fell into a hush so deep, even the sound of breathing seemed loud. No one moved. No one clapped. They just felt it. Felt what it meant for a boy to carry silence his whole life, and to finally break it with love. He looked up, voice steady now. "He never got to hear my voice on a stage like this. But tonight, he speaks here with me." And in that moment, the award didn't matter. The fame didn't matter. Only the echo of a whisper that had waited years to be heard. The tape ended, but no one clapped. Not because they didn't care, but because no one wanted to break the moment. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Some had tears in their eyes. Others stared stunned, as if they had just witnessed something holy. He stood at the mic, holding back his own tears. I used to think I didn't come from much. No money, no big speeches, just a man who couldn't talk. He looked at the cassette in his hand like it was something sacred. But it turns out, my father said more in silence than most people say in a lifetime. He didn't plan to, but he pressed play again. And this time, he let the whisper echo. I love you. It floated out of the speakers and into a hall filled with sound. The rustle of suits, the soft sniffles, the click of a camera shutter. And yet, somehow, that whisper still cut through everything. People would talk about that moment for years. Not about the award, not about the son's fame, but about the tape, the voice, the broken, beautiful whisper that said what all of us need to hear. I love you. That night, clips of the speech went viral. The audio was replayed around the world. And for the first time ever, the man who had once been silent and seen and unheard was listened to by millions. Because one son believed his father's voice, even in a whisper, was still worth sharing. The hall stood in silence as he stepped back from the microphone. No applause came right away, and he didn't need it. This wasn't a performance. It was a goodbye. He looked down at the cassette one last time. The gold star had faded, but the meaning had only grown louder. He took a breath, not to speak, but to hold the moment still, just a second longer. My father never spoke aloud, but his voice raised me. He said it quietly, not for the cameras, not for the crowd, just for him, and maybe for the man who had once sat in a dim room, whispering love into plastic tape. The lights dimmed. No music played, just a soft hiss, the sound of a cassette still turning, long after the words were done, and slowly fade to black.